think it's a good time to start. And yeah, I really want to welcome all of you, all visitors, and of course the speakers of today. And I want to start by giving a brief introduction to all of you. So yeah, welcome Brody. Brody is a Berlin artist, Berlin-based artist, not Berlin artist, but based there, who facilitates and documents game-like group encounters. And with that, he probes the individual, material, and political ramifications of dissociative phenomena. The works are often made in collaboration with researchers, which, yeah, the work we see today is also, that is the case, but also craftspeople or other artists and public participants. So that's a very important part. And I just want to give a few examples, like, yeah, for example, level 5 investigated the shifts in the narrative self through role play. And that was shown in the Berlin Biennale in 2016. Then the response priming, that was basically group encounter sessions that were based on experimental flow diagrams that were also made in a collaboration with psychology researchers. And that was shown in the Athens Biennale in 2018. 4 session was an existential therapy with craftspeople focused on objects that were relevant to their practice. So that was, for example, a bowl linked to past trauma or a shaman's fractured selves. And that was shown in the Anyang Public Arts Project in 2014. And these embodied and dematerialized works consider the subjective experience of the participants that, yeah, he works with, and that not as a just residual response to a constructed situation, but really as the medium itself. The locus of the work is therefore unseen, and the artist Brody here functions as a catalyst or facilitator with the potential to offer the participating subjects critically reflective access to a specific experiential spectrum. And Brody also brought along Philip Corlett. Hello, Philip. Thanks for coming. Philip Corlett is trained in experimental psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and psychiatry at the University of Cambridge, and he works as a director of the Belief, Learning, and Memory Lab at Yale, where he investigates the neural basis of human associative learning and belief formation. Relating these processes to the formation of delusional beliefs, Dr. Corlett's findings have shaped the development of novel mechanistic model of delusion formation, which I believe he will share with us in a moment. And then welcome Hito. Hito Steyerl is a filmmaker and writer, also based in Berlin, where she also teaches at the UDK, the New Media Art at the University of Arts in Berlin, where she also founded the Research Center for Proxy Politics. And through her work, she focuses our gaze on the intersection of media, technology, political violence, and desire. She has steadily developed her very own politics of the image, where she twists politics of representation around the representation of politics. She has worked extensively with predictive neural networks, pointing to their prophetic service in the military-industrial complex and the data sacking and digesting tech companies, pointing to the unpredictable ways that artificial intelligence creates imaginary futures that already affect us gravely in the present. And through her great sensitivity to analogies, Steyerl uncovers and creates stories describing realities that are stranger than fiction. And I think that this skill can also become relevant in our following conversation. Thank you, Hito. Thank you all for coming. And now I will give the word to Brody, who will start with an introduction to prediction error. Yeah.
Okay, how's that look? Looks good on your end?
It looks great.
Okay. So thanks to Karina. I'll start. I'll start with that. And what I'll try to do in under 15 minutes to 20 minutes is a short intro related to my work, just to give a little context and the blend and bleed theme. Then I'll look a little bit at the delusion formation work of Phil. And then after Phil presents on delusion formation and prediction processing, there'll be a short question and answer, and I will introduce a prediction processing model. And then that will guide us, and then we'll become elements from that model. That'll last about 45 minutes. And then we'll have a bit of a debrief and set of questions. And then there's a break. And of course, then we're lucky to have Hito here to talk about, have a discussion with us about machine hallucination. First, I would want to give thanks to the people that supported this work. So this was made during an ARTEC remote air in 2020 with support from Consult Trondheim and Stephanie Hessler. And I'd like to start with a very short clip from Future Gestalt from 2012.
I'm rancid, I'm rotting, I'm dripping, I'm gooey, I'm severed. I think it's sad because it died with the other beings. Its family is dead too. It's sad. It's sad that it's gonna not see its family again. It's sad that it's angry.
So for about almost 20 years, I've been so slowly trudging through unpacking dissociative phenomena. And that ranges from dissociative disorders to our relationship with the screen, to drug experiences, religious experiences. And after a period of time doing screen-based work with real-time 3D, I shifted actually back to performance to start using live action role-playing strategies. And often working directly with clinical psychologists, in this case a Gestalt psychotherapist, and combining those LARP techniques, lab role-playing techniques, with mostly historical group therapeutic techniques that kind of are related to particular periods of time. Now, also, so why LARP in psychology now? And so one, it allowed me to create, in this case, a Future Gestalt, a kind of experiential essay. So I was able to experientially combine the live role players or the players in this environment with this Tony Smith sculpture that you see here, this sort of piece of American minimalism that was sort of being generated at, slightly after these kind of late cybernetics, and also around the same time, later Gestalt therapy was being created. So this, or being developed by Friedrich Perls. And so you had these kind of three examples of systems thinking that we're able to experientially move through for a period of about 4 hours. And the role-playing layer allowed for some kind of critical distance on that subject. So here, I mean, of course, my base was, the program founded by Alan Caprow, and I went there not understanding what Professor Emeritus meant, but we were able to connect later. And so I very much connected to these group encounters guided by obscure rules, these pervasive group encounters. They're very much like pervasive LARPs that I had been playing in Los Angeles before I went to school in Southern California. And in relationship to experiments, so here we see another group encounter guided by obscure rules, these social psychology experiments. Here Zimbardo is asking, will strangers help someone that has fallen in the street? Those are some of the early influences. I mean, when I asked John Barge, this kind of situational experiment pioneer at Yale, where did these social psychology experiments go? The first thing he said to me was, well, one, it's very tough to reproduce them, but also we need the big N. We need lots of data. We need more numbers, and we just couldn't get the data sample with some of the social psychology experiments that he was doing. Now, also, I want to jump to, this is a work called Fall Experiment. And this will kind of explain a little bit about my shift into experimental psychology. And this is a work with Christine Borland, and we did this in 2016, I believe, at Strum Den Haag in the Netherlands. So what you're looking at, this image that you're looking at here, this is an image by Willem Jacob Gravasanda, and he lived from 1688 to 1742. It's his most famous experiment. And the experiment consisted of dropping metal spheres from different heights into clay and measuring the width of the impression. And why is this important? Is because it disproved a popular theory by Newton, who described these elegant theories of force and gravitation, but didn't decisively and experimentally demonstrate or show how it works. At that time, it was assumed that gravitation was a manifestation of divine intervention. Gravity was the hand of God pushing the balls down. Matter was passive. Now, the experiment here is demonstrated by Tiemen Koikot from the Natural Sciences Museum in Boerhaave, or Museum Boerhaave in Leiden. Now, it's from Tiemen's point of view, Gravasanda's experiment demonstrated the idea that matter contains an active principle. So the experiment was a threat at the time because it could imply materialism. So if you're interested in more information on the experiment, you can see the link here. Now, why is this important? So it's a performative sculpture that elegantly used impressions in clay that tell you something not just about free will, but also about the universal laws of nature. It's sort of my ideal, if I could make a work a performative sculpture that did that. That would be a goal. And what you're looking at here is our sculpture, our recreation of the experimental apparatus. And we produced clay from the local river mud and produced iron blooms from the regional soil. Now here's a recreation or a demonstration, based on this theory of physics that was common in Leiden around the time. Demonstration or modified version of the experiment at a period location in Leiden. So this is our images from, this is a sculpture of Wilhelm Wundt. He founded the first lab for an experimental study of the mind in 1879. So last year I visited a small museum in Leipzig focused on material from his lab. And the following, this is from George Mandler in his book, A History of Modern Experimental Psychology. So he says the experiments at Wundt's lab in Leipzig had heavily influenced psychologists at the turn of the century, and most American labs were opened by his students with imported German instruments. And the development of Wundt's politics are reflected in his psychology. And he sort of had two very important periods. So he was active in the collective kind of mid-1800s workers' movements in Germany and developed an early justification that combined these objective methods with self-observation. And the mind could be studied effectively by studying the conscious thoughts of a person. But later, according to the Wundt historian Aneros Meichner-Metzger, he had rigid habits. He had formed very rigid habits. He was known to walk precisely from the same route from his home in Leipzig to his lab every day. His route was only interrupted once by tanks during the November Revolution in 1918. So this was near his death in 1920, and this once liberal radical had become an elderly nationalist reactionary. And by that time, his social concerns and his interest in the dimension of the social mind, or social dimension of the human mind, were overtaken by a rigid sensory psychology, mostly psychometric tests. This contrast, this split between a tightly reasoned mathematical psychology and an observational attitude towards those products of the mind that generate language and culture that are beyond measurement, it's sort of still with us to some degree today. We'll talk a bit about how that's softening now and why work with live role playing is useful for that. But I'm also, another question I have is when I visit the experimental psychology labs, I mean, so far it's in the labs in Athens or Stockholm or Yale and in Norway. I'm wondering consistently what my role is in this situation. I mean, there's no lack of science and art research-based collaborations today, but I'm not totally convinced that the way in which that's playing out is useful. But here, so I went back to sort of an earlier artist scientist collaboration, and this is in the lab in Leipzig, is this disembodied floating hand, for example, and also the sculptural bust of Wundt that you saw. They were made by the symbolist artist Max Klinger in 1912. I'm not exactly sure of the relationship between the two, but Klinger lived from 1857 to about 1920. Here you see it's another piece from the museum in Leipzig of his, the New Salon in 1893. And it's a disembodied head at the feet of a sculpture of Salome. Of course, she was depicted as a temptress and in this kind of fashionably misogynist way at the time. But Klinger is best known for this series of engravings inspired by dreams after he found a glove on an ice skating rink. So these dreamlike or hallucinogenic quality of the images, they predated surrealism and Freud's work on dreams. This one, Ein Handschuh. This is anxieties. These kind of strange animals, creatures, sleeping under this glove that he had found on the ice rink. Now, I'll jump back to my visit. So my first visit to Yale was with the Center for Collaborative Arts and Media. This is where I met Phil in 2018. And when I visit the labs, my question is, well, let me step back. When I visit the labs and I ask the researchers, I tell the researchers what I'm interested in, they say, well, we're not really doing experiments with animals right now, or there's really nothing for you to see, there's nothing for you to film. And that was almost a consistent response across the board. What I found is that there were elements to see, but it was just the craftsperson from Wundt's time had become the programmer, had become the data analyst, and brass had become digital objects. It had become code. It had become data analysis. It had become flowcharts, and all of these tools are there to operationalize or identify the hidden states underlying our emotions, the tools and processes. These tools and processes that we use to identify them are embodied, but they're often also dematerialized. And so this is an image from my work, Future Gestalt. And this is an image of a newer work working with a support vector machine algorithms. So, how does this data relate to this neurotic affect? I mean, these were some of my questions as I'm running these live role-playing scenarios, and then starting to gather data, how does this data relate to this underlying behavior that's like floating up to the surface and as neurotic affect? And here's an example of a prediction error diagram that we'll look at, or that Phil, this is from Anil Seth, and Phil will talk a little bit more about and describe prediction error later. And here's my version that's a combination of multiple prediction error diagrams. So it's important to note when we move into the workshop that and they're also that I'm not being influenced by the diagrams. It was sort of immediately clear their relationship with dance choreography documents and especially algorithmic choreography. And there are others here who obviously work with algorithmic choreography, and I'd love to hear more from them. But for me, it really started with Trisha Brown and some of her choreography documents and other works that I was making previous to this. I think this started in about 2009. Game-like works based on Trisha Brown's pole pieces. Here's just a quick example of that. So there are 3 rules to this scenario. They to keep the ends of the poles connected. They were a world engine, and if the poles disconnected and they had to keep spinning, and if the poles disconnected, that world sort of fell apart. Again, a kind of like world engine. Next. This is at LACMA, I believe, in LA. So we would run these for about 4 to 8 hours at a time. And if you're familiar with Trisha Brown's lineup work, then you would sort of recognize that in these pieces. Now, I'll jump back to specifically prediction error and Phil. So during the visit at Yale, I visited the Belief, Learning, and Memory Lab, Phil's lab there, and I was specifically interested in his experiments exploring delusion formation. So, I mean, I have an appreciation for neurotic affect, whether it's kind of the vernacular. I worked with addicts in the past and people in the recovery community, and so there's this kind of I do have an appreciation for this this sort of vernacular movement that kind of again rises to the surface, and here I found out that Phil was connecting healthy volunteers to a machine. This kind of, to me, which seemed a very nefarious machine that algorithmically dosed them with ketamine to this for a fairly long period of time based on their blood plasma level. And as far as I understand, put them in an MRI machine, and then barrage them with these seemingly nefarious psychometric tasks and odd questions, questions that would start mild. So, do you ever feel as if some people are what they seem? Do you ever speak with God? Do you have a special connection with God or some kind of telepathic power? And Phil will talk a little bit more about that more later. And here's an example of a delusion double experiment with Phil in the lab.
In or out?
In. Out.
Out or in?
Out. In. In.
In or out?
Out. In.
And Phil will talk a little bit about that experiment later. So when we speak about, and I'll hand it over to Phil after this, and this is the paper where you can learn more about his experiment from prediction error to psychosis. Ketamine is a pharmacological model of delusions. So, and Phil will define this as well later, along with kind of a more specific description of delusion and hallucination. But what are we talking about when we're talking about prediction error? So prediction error refers to these mismatches between an organism's expectation in a given environment and what actually happens. And when aberrant prediction errors, so this is necessary for homeostasis, where we're sort of predicting our environment, but when there are aberrant prediction errors that become heavily weighted, we start to experience delusion. And again, Phil will speak more about that in detail after this. So thanks a lot. I want to hand it over, Karina, to Phil.
Good morning, everyone. Just going to share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my name's Phil Corlett. You've heard about some of my work at Yale, and much like Brody, this has been a sort of long-term journey for me. For the past 20 years or so now, I've been trying to figure out how we can map experiences and beliefs and understand them by scanning the brain. So that makes me a cognitive neuroscientist, because I measure the brain to try and understand and learn something new about the mind. And the mental processes that we care about most in my lab revolve around psychosis, which is a word I'm sure many of you have heard, but it's sort of a term of art for us. The way that we think about it in my lab is that psychotic symptoms like hallucinations and delusions are really sort of profound departures from consensual reality. And when people experience them with distress and discomfort, or they induce distress and discomfort in others, they're considered to be a symptom of serious mental illness and something that's sort of needful of clinical attention and treatment. So this is our definition of what a delusional belief is. It's a fixed belief, so it doesn't change in the face of contradictory evidence or counter argument. They tend to have sort of themes that focus around one's relationship to other people and kind of power dynamics, which I think is really interesting and sort of relatively poorly understood, although something that we're pursuing quite actively now in the lab. We get off the hook around religious beliefs because they're deemed bizarre if they're not shared by people from your same culture. And in this new version of the definition from our diagnostic and statistical manual, which came out, version 5 came out about 7 years ago now, there's this acknowledgement of the challenge of distinguishing sort of run-of-the-mill unusual ideas from delusions. You know, I am pretty active on Twitter, and one of the things I follow is the use of the word delusion, and it has become much part, and hallucination too, and both words have become much more part of our political discourse, and almost like a sort of pejorative insult that's thrown around, particularly here in the US. We accuse other people of being delusional, we accuse them of hallucinating. And as we tried to sort of explore this space a bit more with tasks and behavioral measures, we found that it is rather difficult actually to distinguish certain unusual political beliefs and extreme ideas and experiences from what we might call clinical delusions. In the definition, they point at conviction. What I'm going to show you today is actually that it's the degree of distress, as I mentioned. You can find people out in the world who are as convinced and immune to contradictory evidence around their beliefs as people with schizophrenia, but you can very rarely find somebody who is as distressed by those beliefs and experiences as a person with schizophrenia who's harboring a delusion or experiencing hallucinations. So this is an example. It's the Capgras delusion. It's rather like the invasion of the body snatchers. It was discovered in the 1800s in Paris by two neurologists, Capgras and Rebou-Lachaud. This is an example, a 74-year-old married housewife diagnosed with a psychotic illness because she believes her husband has been replaced by another unrelated man. And it's driving her actions, right? So she's refusing to sleep in the same room as the imposter. She's locking herself in her room, and she asks her son to procure a gun for her to protect her against this imposter. Now, I want to be very clear that people with serious mental illness are much more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators. But certain times, these delusional beliefs and hallucinations often have kind of manifest conviction with quite tragic consequences. So this is another reason why this isn't just an important kind of interesting academic exercise, it's a clinically relevant and salient one too. The definition of hallucinations, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit more, I'm not going to talk about so much, but we do have a package of work relating predictive processes to hallucinations too, which I'll very briefly allude to at the end. Definition here is much more simple: percept without an external stimulus, occurring in a conscious and awake state and having all of the qualities of a real perception. So they feel real. There are, of course, challenges and problems with this definition too, simple as it is. I mean, many of us will have experienced hallucinations as we fall asleep or wake up, hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations, but nevertheless, a workable definition and some sort of roadmaps, I think, for developing a cognitive neuroscience of these symptoms, right? So if we can understand something about how beliefs are formed and updated in the brain, we might get some clues about delusions. And if we can understand something too about perception and reality monitoring, then we might get some ideas about hallucinations too. And in my lab, the sort of conclusion that we're moving towards is actually the distinction between delusions and hallucinations might be a false one, and it might not be that helpful or useful. This is an example of a hallucination that's typically expressed by somebody with schizophrenia. So a young university student who over the past year or so has come to have the experience of people talking about him when he's on his own, typically sort of discussing what he's thinking, commenting on his thoughts and his actions, and he's formed a sort of delusion-like explanation for where this might have come from or why it might be happening, that the security agents in MI5, which James Bond is part of, are plotting against him, observing him and trying to kill him. And as I mentioned, we take a very, very reductionist approach. That isn't to rob these symptoms of their meaning or their importance. It's really just to try and get a handhold on, or some sort of fulcrum empirically on what might be going on in somebody's brain when they're having one of these beliefs or experiences. And the simplest sort of approach in psychology, the most reductionist one, I think, is Pavlovian conditioning. So in Pavlov's original experiments, he would pair a metronome, it wasn't actually a bell, ticking with the presentation of a valued food reward to the animal. And over a series of instances of this experience, the animal comes to preempt the delivery of the steak based on the presence of that ticking metronome, such that he will start to salivate in response to the metronome in preparation or anticipation of the delivery of the steak. The way that we think about how humans form cause-effect beliefs is exactly this, through the same sorts of mechanisms that are going on in the dog's brain as it's learning to anticipate the delivery of a steak by the metronome. And we're going to go on to apply that thinking to how delusional beliefs might form. And with regards to hallucinations, the same processes and mechanisms that are afoot might not only be associating causes and effects or cues and outcomes, but actually sensory associations. The sort of ebb and flow of sensory evidence in the world also has predictive statistical structure to it. And we learn about it, we think, through exactly the same learning mechanisms. And if that's true, the same sorts of processes might also apply to hallucinations as well. This is the sort of preeminent prediction error model in psychology. It was developed by two psychologists here at Yale in the 1970s, Barbara Corlett and Alan Wagner. And it's really an overly mathematicized way of saying that we learn from our mistakes, and we learn most when our mistakes are largest. So that term in parentheses, the lambda minus the sum of v's, is prediction error. And in a really nice review of this process by Wolfram Schultz and Tony Dickinson, they say prediction error relates to the very essence of learning. No learning occurs when outcomes are perfectly predicted. And so in a nutshell, what we're going to say is that there are prediction error signals in your brain that are firing off when you need to learn something new about your world. And when those signals are registered inappropriately, either at the wrong time or with the wrong magnitude, you will attend to and learn about things that you wouldn't normally. And that's really the sort of kernel of your delusional beliefs and perhaps your hallucinations too. And this idea sort of tracks back to early neural network theories like Widrow and Hoff's gradient descent models. And it's kind of there in Shannon's information theory and in cybernetics and Norbert Wiener's work too. So there's a real sort of long history of these sorts of ideas, that there's statistical information in the world that we need to glean with our brains and sort of cleave away the useless or not relevant information and respond only to the information that's maximally useful. So in one of the tasks, which I'll try and get you to sort of join with us, we present people whilst they're in the MR scanner or just behaviorally or through mechanical Turk, a series of trials. So we ask you to imagine that you're an allergist and you're going to be confronted by a new patient who suffers allergies from some meals but not others. And your task is, when you see a meal on the screen of 1 or 2 or 3 different foods that he's eaten, you need to predict whether or not he's going to have an allergic reaction. So you see hamburger on the screen and you make your prediction, and then we show you that hamburger causes the allergy. And you see that over and over again. You see hamburger, you see allergy, you see hamburger, you see allergy. And after a whole host of different cues and trials where you're learning some foods that cause allergies, some foods that don't, we then introduce you to this type of trial where you see something that you've learned about before, the hamburger, and something new that you've never seen before, and you make a prediction and you see the outcome. Now, critically here, what do you learn? What does your brain do? How does your behavior change in response to this novel and somewhat irrelevant food? You'll note that the allergy here was of exactly the same magnitude, and all of it is fully predicted by the presence of this hamburger. There's nothing new to learn here. And in fact, if I track your eyes whilst you're looking at these trials, you don't even look at this. You look entirely and focus your attention on the hamburger. And so the question is, what do you learn about the bananas? And is that different in people who are currently psychotic and developing delusional beliefs? And the answer is that if you're not psychotic, you form a pretty strong expectation, a pretty strong confident belief that the hamburger is going to cause the allergy, and not so much of an opinion, in fact, perhaps even a sort of slightly negative belief about the bananas. However, if you're somebody who's in the Psych ED because you're suffering from psychotic symptoms and you take a break to play this game with us very briefly for 15 minutes or so, you can see that important things feel different and different things feel important to people with psychotic illnesses. They don't imbue the causal cue with enough power, and they look and learn about the irrelevant cue too much. So we think this is some preliminary behavioral evidence for aberrant prediction error signals going on in the brains of people and driving them to learn about these irrelevant events. Now we can do this in the MR scanner, as Brody mentioned. We can take pictures of your brain. It's actually a blood flow measure, but we sort of, through algorithmic manipulations, kind of infer changes in neural activity. And what we see is when we show you the cue that you shouldn't have learned very much about, now causing the allergy, there's a signal in your brain in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that's engaged. This signal and region seem to carry a sort of surprise signal or prediction error. It's surprised by events that ought not to happen, and it's really not very engaged by things that are predictable and highly run-of-the-mill. That's not the case if you're somebody with first episode psychosis. So these are two groups of people matched for various other demographic characteristics like age, gender, race, socioeconomic status. And what you can see is in the brains of patients with psychosis, there's some evidence that they've learned about that irrelevant cue. They're not very surprised by it causing the allergy, and they're too surprised by it not causing the allergy. There's a sort of blurring of the distinction between surprising and unsurprising events in the brains of patients with first episode psychosis. Now, this is all clinically relevant and important, but we want to show that it's sort of specific, right? And so what we find is that when we pull out the signal from that brain region and we correlate it to the severity of the delusions that people experience, the sort of smaller the distinction in height of these two bars, the more that that brain region is engaged when it really ought not to be. Too much prediction error is associated with much more severe delusions. So we think there's a really nice link between the presence of this neural signal, this psychological process, and this psychiatric symptom. And I should say that this is taking into account all of the other things that might be going on in the lives of somebody with first episode psychosis. So we regress out their medication dose, we regress out their other psychiatric symptoms and sort of comorbid problems. This is a very specific relationship between delusions and this brain signal. Now, Brody mentioned that we also, I think he said, nefariously give people ketamine. It's something that we've been doing many years in Cambridge when I was doing my PhD, and then at Yale. It was actually pioneered at Yale. Before ketamine became a miraculous antidepressant, we used to use it as a model for psychosis, because in healthy people, we can give it at a dose that is sort of transiently and reversibly inductive of a sort of psychosis-like state. So remember at the beginning, my example was a Capgras delusion, somebody who misidentified somebody very well known to them. This is something that somebody said after a ketamine infusion. They said to me, every time I left the room, they thought another person dressed in my clothes was coming back into the room. It wasn't scary. It was just another person dressed in my clothes doing my job. a little bit older and weighing a little bit more. Now, sadly, both of these things have happened over the past 10 years at Yale, but not on that particular time scale. However, the nice thing about this procedure is that we can kind of induce the onset and the offset of these experiences with some sort of experimental control using the infusion pump that Brody alluded to. And we can give people this infusion, as I mentioned, safely, reversibly, transiently in the scanner whilst they're doing our food allergy task. And this is what happens in people's brains. So when we give them a placebo, so they don't know whether or not they're going to get ketamine or a saline placebo, when we give them a placebo and we ask them to do the task, you see their brain response is just like our control subjects. There's a nice, robust prediction error response in exactly that same region of right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in response to things that are surprising, not so much in response to things that are predictable or highly run-of-the-mill. Now, on ketamine, what we see is just like what we saw in first episode psychosis. So whatever ketamine is doing in the brain, it seems like it's sort of recapitulating many of the things that are happening when people first start to get ill and start to experience hallucinations and delusions. Again, important things feel different, different things feel important. The height of these two bars, the difference between the heights of these two bars is much smaller. And just like in our first episode patients, the more severe the delusion-like beliefs, the extent to which they thought I was an imposter or ministrating against them or talking about them behind their back, or that there was much more going on than the experiment. Many of them described it as feeling as though they were in the Truman Show. The more people had that type of experience and belief, the more this exactly the same region of the brain was engaged whilst they were doing this task inappropriately. And that was sort of, those two things were correlated with one another. So there's a really nice sort of relationship across this experimental model of psychosis and the real thing that we observe in the real world in actual patients and young people. Now, I mentioned that people have lots of unusual beliefs, and that's been happening even more so over the past year or so with the various conspiracy theories that have sort of risen to the fore in the US and the world more broadly. And as I said, as part of the sort of discourse, people have been accusing one another of being delusional. There are ways of measuring those sorts of experiences with different rating scales. The one that we use in the lab is the Peters Delusion Inventory. So it asks about either 20 or in the longer version, 40 different unusual beliefs that people might have. In this case, do your thoughts ever feel alien to you in some way? So sort of as if they're being inserted into your brain from an external agent. And if you answer yes to that question, that triggers 3 further questions. How distressing is that? How preoccupied are you by that experience, and how convinced are you that it's true? And as I mentioned, if you do this with patients with schizophrenia, they score much more highly on the distress aspect. However, you can find people in various communities, either online or in the real world, who are as preoccupied and as convinced as patients with schizophrenia. But they're very rarely as distressed, often because the belief gives them a sort of sense of community and actually allows them to form a social network rather than disrupting the social networks that they have. So if we give healthy people who don't have psychosis this scale, and we get them to rate their unusual beliefs and the extent to which they find them distressing, we can then, just like we did in our ketamine study and in our patient study, relate their scores, how distressing they find these unusual ideas that they find themselves harboring, to their brain response to our task. Just like in the ketamine case and in the first episode case, now in healthy people, if your brain responds to our task in a manner that's redolent of ketamine or redolent of first episode psychosis, you harbor your beliefs about the world in a manner that's very similar to people with a first episode of psychosis. So the more distressed you are by your unusual beliefs, that the government knows more about UFOs than they're letting on, although actually this week that might actually turn out to be true, the more likely you are to engage this brain region inappropriately in the context of this causal belief formation task. Super simple inferential task that's totally inspired by Pavlovian conditioning principles, giving us a really nice handle on how much broader political and metaphysical beliefs are forming and being harbored by people. I'm a bit sensitive to time, but I know that we're going to be talking about hallucinations later, and I just want to draw this line between delusion formation, delusion maintenance, and hallucination. So on the screen here, what you can see is a rotating mask of Charlie Chaplin's face. And as you start to see the inside of the mask, something kind of unusual is going to happen. Round about now, it's going to seem to you as though the mask changed rotational direction, and it didn't. It continued to rotate clockwise, but because your brain has the overwhelming experience that faces point outwards and that light falls on convex objects in particular ways, the way that you make sense of seeing the inside of a mask is to infer that it switched rotational direction. Your prior beliefs about how light works and faces work and objects in the world work overrode your sensory evidence to the extent that you formed an unusual and errant conclusion about what's actually going on. And we think in the lab that that's what's happening when people have hallucinations. So it's not prediction errors per se, although it might be driven by prediction errors, but the end point is a very, very strong belief about the world that doesn't actually obtain. And it's so strong that it can cause you to have perceptions where no perceptions are appropriate to have. Now, I mentioned that voices are pretty common in schizophrenia, hearing voices in one's head. The hallucinations that people experience tend not to be as visual, they're much more auditory. And we think they're driven by the presence and strength of prior expectations about speech. So I'm going to play you some stimuli that we use from one of the experiments to show that that's true, and hopefully we'll do a little bit of an experiment on you. So hopefully you can hear this. So it sort of sounds like R2-D2. Did you hear that? I'll play it one more time. Now I'm going to play you another stimulus, and we'll see if you...
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
So that was actual speech in English, a female voice saying the camel was kept in a cage at the zoo. Now I play you the R2-D2 stimulus again, and you can't unhear it. The speech is detectable now because I played you the template from which that
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
That's an example of a stimulus that we've degraded by breaking it down into a series of sine waves. It's supposed to make the speech unintelligible, but when I play you the template from which it was originally created, your brain forms a prior expectation through which it can now understand the speech signal that was present in the R2-D2 sounding stimulus.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
When we play those sorts of stimuli to people who hear voices in their heads, they can actually detect the speech before we tell them that there's any there. So these are a group of non-clinical voice hearers from my colleagues in Durham, particularly Ben Alderson-Day, who led this experiment. And what he showed was, as I mentioned, people who hear voices in their heads can hear the speech even in that R2-D2 sine wave stimulus. And the more they hear voices in their everyday lives, the more early they detect those stimuli. Given that you all, I don't know much about your sort of psychiatric history or whether or not you experience these sorts of symptoms, but for the most part, I'm going to assume that you all aren't mentally ill. You are, though, however, susceptible to these sorts of effects. And I think healthy brains even are always on the verge of hallucinating and forming delusional beliefs because they're sort of almost adaptive ways of organizing and responding to the world. So let's see. So the idea behind these sorts of models is that everything that we perceive is a sort of controlled hallucination. We don't just passively receive information from the world. We form hypotheses and make predictions about what's about to come next. And to the extent that those predictions are correct and everything rolls out as we think it ought to, that's fine. However, if there are any mismatches between what we've learned to expect and what we actually experience, that can have multiple different consequences. If the prediction error isn't particularly strong or salient, we can just ignore it and override it. We can use it to update our future beliefs, or we can form a totally new belief to try and explain what's happening. And our argument is that in the case of psychosis, there's a lot of aberrant belief formation happening because of errant error signals in the brain. I'm really fond of this quote from Anil Seth, who Brody mentioned earlier. He says, we're all hallucinating all of the time, and when we agree about our hallucinations, we call it reality. And so there's this idea that there are sort of things out in the world that we want to perceive accurately or at least adaptively as possible. And in order to do that, we sort of form a model in our minds and in our brains about what would have to be out there in the world in order to make the data that's incident upon us make sense. That's the kind of computational task of the brain and the mind. At the algorithmic level, it's something like Bayes' theorem that's being implemented in our brains. And Bayes was a mathematician and a clergyman. He actually died before his paper was published. And much like the Rescorla and Wagner rule, what he said was that in order to reason efficiently and appropriately about data in light of our hypotheses, we want to sort of weight the extent to which a particular datum is surprising or salient relative to our hypotheses. And we think that might actually be happening in the hierarchical organization of certain brain systems. There are some people that say that's how everything in the brain and mind works. I think I'm a little bit more circumspect, but I do think that in sensory cortices, and as we're forming hypotheses about our sensory experiences, this type of machinery might be in play. And the machinery works like this. Nearer to sensory organs like your eyes and your ears and your skin, data flow inwards through effectors like the receptors in your retina. However, there's quite a lot of top-down machinery that's sending predictions about what those signals should be. And anything that doesn't match with those predictions is or can be sent upwards through the hierarchy in order to change your beliefs. This bottom-up and top-down arrangement is sort of coupled with a middle-out form of processing that we think is mediated by many of the neuromodulatory systems like dopamine and acetylcholine and serotonin. These are the brain systems that many of the drugs that we give to people to treat their psychiatric symptoms act upon. They're also the site or the locus of many drugs of abuse and psychedelic drugs too. And what those systems do is bias whether or not you're receptive to a prediction error or whether you go with your prediction. And so every act that we engage in, every time that we talk to another person and try and make inferences about what they're trying to tell us, as you're trying to listen to what I'm saying and form an opinion about me and my reliability as a communicator and a scientist, it's an inferential process. You're judging your prior knowledge about all of this stuff with the information that I've just imparted upon you. And if I said something that really resonated with you, it's much more likely that you'll change your opinion and update your belief and probably conclude that I'm a reliable person and source of information. I hope. But maybe that hasn't happened at all. Maybe you think I'm just full of shit and you can discard what I've just said because you don't think the mind or the brain work like that, or you think that we're making too drastic a reductionist a set of assumptions about what's going on in psychosis. I think these ways of thinking are really attractive because you can kind of see how broad they might reach. I've mentioned that in the lab, we do quite a bit of work now on political beliefs and how they've been impacted by the pandemic and the evolving kind of pandemic responses that have been instituted at varying degrees at different states. One of the beauties of being able to gather data on a really large scale, as Brody alluded to earlier, is that we can look at how people behave in different states and how that behavior changed as a function of the evolving pandemic and as a function of the local rules that were imposed. I don't have the data here to show you, they're under review at the moment. But I guess what I'm saying is that with this really simple arrangement, we can think not only about brains and individual bodies, but we can think about kind of collective groups of people and the formation of social norms or not, and
That's,
how that impacts people.
and Phil, I just wanted to mention that's so important, especially because in the context of Blend and Bleed and these live role-playing strategies or immersive co-creative events that this series is talking about. Could you speak a little more about, because I hear a lot about the social turn or social cognition, and or you've mentioned delusion, using these prediction processing models to understand delusion, not just at an individual level, but at a social level.
Yeah,
can you
absolutely.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So, the sort of the cognitive revolution that happened in experimental psychology in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s was very much focused on the individual. We didn't really have the means or the appetite to explore anything above an N of 1. We looked at lots of N's of 1 and sort of collapsed across them and tried to come up with rules and theories about individual behaviors. But as we became increasingly connected as a culture via the internet and opportunities to test people on a much broader and kind of grander scale emerged, people became interested in collective behavior again. And I think it was partly a computational turn, and partly, I think, a desire to sort of understand the types of processes that were in play in those Zimbardo experiments, but in a much more fine-grained way, and in a way that answered some of the challenges that John Barge mentioned, right? Like if I can do a group dynamic experiment on Amazon Mechanical Turk, maybe not necessarily with a real group, but as long as people believe that they're interacting with another group of people, that doesn't seem to make a huge difference. And now with those sorts of approaches, we can get to, reasonable and sample sizes and appropriate kind of statistical power. There has been, and there continues to be, a voracious kind of social turn in neuroscience. People want to talk about these mechanisms and how they're instantiated in the brain and what their relevance is to healthy function and to serious mental illness too. I'm a tiny bit more skeptical. I think, or actually, I wouldn't say I'm skeptical because I'm totally engaged in this work. I worry that by focusing on the social so much, we start to posit modules in the brain that handle social information. And I think what I've shown you here is that sort of exquisitely socially sensitive, unusual beliefs and experiences can arise from an extremely domain general mechanism, right? Prediction error doesn't have categories. It doesn't really have sort of specifically devoted modules in the brain or the mind that handle its processing. It's kind of domain general. That's not to say that there aren't domain-specific mechanisms for social interaction that are going on in the human brain and mind, right? We're using them right now as we try and sort of learn about one another and communicate with one another through language. But if you want to make an account of delusions or hallucinations that's specifically social, then it really ought to be only the purview of those kind of linguistic, metacognitive operations. And so one of the debates that I'm engaged in right now is how far can you get with a really simple learning mechanism like these kind of Pavlovian conditioning ideas without loading on those sort of more complex linguistic kind of propositional mechanisms. And my belief, and I hope some of the data we've shown you today and some other data I could show you, is that you can get really far without even appealing to those things. And why does that matter? Well, if psychosis is only the purview of these very higher level evolved mechanisms, then there's no point trying to model it or figure out its biology in experimental animals in order to develop better medications and treatments. Now, whether or not you agree with that in principle or ethically is a different discussion, but it's happening. And knowing the answer to that question should give us an empirical basis to decide whether to do that more or less, whether or not it's worth pursuing those sorts of experiments or not. So either way, wherever you stand on that debate, I still think it's worth knowing how human specific and social these symptoms might be. My suggestion is that they're not very much, actually, and that you can actually model beliefs in simpler organisms. And you might even be able to model them in neural networks.
Is there someone who has a question, who wants to, or a comment at this point? Otherwise, also you can think about it more and come back to it. Then if that's not the case, then I would just want to maybe ask you to help me understand, because I was a bit wondering about in this whole thing where the category of the pathology sits with one way apparently you described to say to how to divide a healthy from a sick person who experiences hallucination is that one feels okay and one feels distressed, and then the social acceptance sits kind of in between there, where the one who feels okay generally probably is hallucinating about something that is socially accepted, whereas the other one isn't. And yeah, I mean, this I guess this would be not a very ethical experiment, but do you know if the people who are distressed and they are so to say sick, would they feel better if you would tell them that what they see is true? And yeah,
that's a wonderful question. And it kind of happens already. So much like there are sort of 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous groups, there are actually hearing voices groups that people who are identify as patients and people who don't identify as patients come together, once a week or once a month in a library or some sort of setting privately, and talk in a group about what it is to be somebody who hears voices or has unusual beliefs and experiences. And their sort of motto is that voices are real, and they garner a certain degree of acceptance and sort of positive gain from knowing that there are other people out in the world who have similar experiences to them, right? Psychosis is sort of traditionally a very kind of othering and negative experience, but it doesn't have to be. So one of the things that we do in the lab is work with a group of people who believe that they're psychic and that they get auditory messages from beyond the grave. And we've compared their performance on our tasks and their behavior to patients who hear voices. And we can't necessarily, at a very sort of broad-grained level, tell the difference. But when we fit computational models, what we find is that people who are psychic have very strong prior beliefs, but are able to update those beliefs in light of evolving evidence in our tasks. Whereas patients, regardless of their hallucination status, find it much harder to change their minds and update their beliefs. And I wonder whether that distress is a product of having a set of beliefs that constantly butt up against reality and constantly need to be defended against. That can be exhausting. As a scientist who sometimes says things that other scientists don't agree with, I find that kind of tiresome and very draining. And I can't imagine being in the world like that at all times and having your sort of senses conflate your reality at all times. So yeah, when we don't have a perfect distinction, there's no test that says that somebody's psychotic or not, but we're beginning to build a set of characteristics around how you form your beliefs, how you change your mind, and how you interact with other people that might allow us to distinguish between people who are needful of care versus people who aren't. It's not perfect yet, but we're making some steps in the right direction.
Thank you. Right. Thanks for the answer. Yeah, I guess, unfortunately, I think we are really a bit running out of time. So we don't have to rush through the performance. I would say thank you so much, Philip, and also Brody for your presentation. So yeah, I give it back to you, Brody. Let's play.
You can briefly switch to speaker view if you want to, just to describe the model a little bit that Phil was talking about. So what we're talking about here is this bidirectional, like information is moving in two directions simultaneously. And as Phil said, from the lower sensory parts, motor sensory system, up to these more abstract representational levels here at the top. And again, you might need to go into the speaker view to see this image larger. And so so the brain is making predictions. Well, let's start down here at input. So there's a world interaction, right? There's a sensory stimulus that's coming in from the world. And Phil may correct me on some of this later, but I'll just keep going. To what is here a pyramidal neuron. And this is all happening, of course, simultaneously in different parts of the brain. So these higher abstract levels are making predictions about the world based on this modified sensory input. The predictions are coming down the hierarchy, and the prediction errors are going up the hierarchy. So again, there's this kind of world interaction. And that sensory input is then weighed against the prediction or the model of the world that the mind has made with what the brain thinks is going to happen, right? And then it decides how seriously to take that prediction, and it moves it up to the next level. And it's sort of this all happening simultaneously. And not to mention, so there's here at the output phase, there's a decision that's made. You either update the model or you update the world, right? And then it kind of starts again. There's new world interaction. And what we mean when we're talking about, as far as I can understand, what we're talking about, prediction errors are happening all the time. We just, as Phil said, we just choose how seriously or how much salience they have for us. And when that prediction error system starts to break down for various reasons, for example, we pay, as far as I understand, we give more salience, more weight to the aberrant prediction error. So, for example, and it's often things that are sort of in our periphery. If you've experienced voluntary or involuntary hallucinations, you may have an experiential understanding of this. But for example, I'm standing and looking at the screen right now, but across the street there's a car door opening and closing, and I can barely hear it in my peripheral auditory field. There's also in front of me a red piece of wood that's against my wall. And then there's a clock over here to the right of me, right? And so I'll start to, normally I wouldn't give too much salience to this background peripheral information, or I wouldn't make conjectural leaps or connections between the two. But let's say the prediction error system is off. I'll start to connect somehow this car door opening and closing to the clock ticking, to there's something nefarious about this red piece of wall that's driving the car, that's connected to the car door that's opening and closing. And so these delusions will start to get set in the mind. So, and keep in mind, we're talking here specifically about in this case, delusions of belief and auditory and auditory and visual hallucinations. There's a researcher like Anil Seth who's applied this to physical hallucinations, so hallucinations of the body, which is really interesting, actually, but we won't get to this today. And this is kind of a really super basic model of that. Now, so what are we actually going to do? So I'm going to jump to get us in there because we're already about 5:45, so we need to go pretty quickly. So if we can make sure that we're all in gallery view and we have A1, B1, A2, B2. Okay. So just raise your hand if you're in the dual column and it's working out for you. You can kind of see each other. Great. Okay. So A1. So what we're going to, it's important that you or that each of you know what stimulus you're looking for. And you're going to take information from two places at once and you're going to combine it. And you're just going to do simple hand motions to make that occur. So A1, since you're here down at the bottom, you're getting a signal from A2 above you. And you're also, because you're at the corner, you're a little bit different than everyone else. You're sending information out to me, right? And you're also looking across, let's see, yeah. Stimulus, yeah, you're also looking across from yourself and you're getting information from B1. So let's stick to that. So I'll just repeat that. You're getting so A2, when A2 makes a hand signal, let's say like this, you're going to repeat that hand signal. But let's say B1 makes a hand signal like this, then you'll find the median in between. And that's A1. So B1, you're getting information here from A1. Oh, I'm sorry. You're sending information to A1. I'm sorry, because you're going to be getting a stimulus from me. So I'm going to be flashing an image on the screen. And you will be B1. You will be the node that's sort of getting us started. So I'll give you a stimulus. You'll match a hand signal to that stimulus. And you'll also, yes, you'll also be looking at A1. So you're getting information from stimulus and A1. So for me, you're the only one that will be looking at me to get a stimulus and A1. It's a little easier, more simple up top. So A2, if someone makes a hand gesture, so A3, for example, is above you, and they're going to make a gesture that's that you'll get information from A3, and you'll also be getting information right directly across from you from B2. So for example, A3, can you make a hand gesture? Any hand gesture. A3. B2, can you make a hand gesture? Now A2, and can you both, A3 and B2, can you hold those gestures for me? Now A2, can you find the median between those two? Exactly. So B2, you're getting your signal, and you can put your hands down. And so the easiest way we found, until you get tired, of course, is as it's all happening, and it happens simultaneously, and it happens very quickly, you can kind of hold your hands up and just kind of look back and forth at the two inputs that you're getting. We're going to start with one hand, and then we'll move to two, and just slowly kind of move and try to find the median, right? And so B2, do you know where you're getting information from? So you're getting in from.
Sorry, I can't really see your graphic because
Yeah, I'll jump it up. Yeah.
The column mode. Yeah.
So you're here, so you're going to be getting information from A1 below you, or B1, I'm sorry, and then you're going to be getting information from A2. And we're not going to worry about these green circles right now, this precision weight, because that's more complex. So A3, do you know where you're getting your two sources of information from? And everybody, all you have to look at are these two spots, these two other nodes. You don't have to pay attention to anything else.
Am I taking information from B3 and A4?
Exactly. And Orion, you're getting information from, does that make sense? Below you at B2 and directly across from you at A3. Yeah. So these two spots. Penny, do you know where you're getting? So you're actually up here at B4. Do you see where you're getting information from? Below
No,
you?
I cannot see the graphic any longer. Could you move up a little?
Yeah. Or it might be easier to just to look at B3, the thumbnail for B3, Orion below you, and then Hito at A4.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, so basically just pay attention to those two. So when B3 makes a gesture and A4 makes a gesture, you're combining those two.
All right.
And so Hito, you are at the top. The model's a little bit hard to see here. If you want to zoom in, you can look at it again in speaker view. But I'm going to be making sound. So the stimulus I'll be using as an input is images, and that's for B1 here. But I'll be making a sound. And so A4, you will be influenced by that sound. And what's happening across from you at Penny, which is B4. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but how do I produce a median between a hand gesture and a sound?
Good question.
Okay.
Give me 1 second. Let me get back to gallery view so I have everybody around. So that's where you'll have to interpret a bit. So there's this. So basically, the sound is sort of, it's a very simple sound, and it's either more intense or less intense. And you can interpret that in any way that you choose. So when it's more intense, that means there's higher prediction error, and so you can move faster or more intensely. So it's just up to you to interpret that.
Okay, and what is my output supposed to be?
Your output goes down below you to A3. And so your output is the movement that you make.
Okay.
And you don't have to worry about where that goes because A3 is below you and they will receive it. So does that make sense? So across from you, you're watching B4, and then you're listening to the sound, and you're improvising a relation between the two. And then B1, you're a little bit the same because you're getting information from an image, from a stimuli outside of the body, and you're combining that with the information across from you at A1. I think that's a long description, so let's just try it and see how we do. And okay, 1 second. I'm going to change. And so this, when you see this, that means stop. When you see the red, um, can you hear that? Is there any sound there? Great. I'm going to check a higher sound, a more intense sound now. Can you hear that? Or any kind of shift? One sec. Is there any shift in the sound that you can notice? Yes or no? Okay. The sound is really subtle. It's not, we don't want to distract us. So, I'm going to start with an initial stimulus. And B1, just start with one hand. Can you hear me, B1? Yeah, so just start with one hand. B2. And you can start to respond as the others. B3. Remember, you're getting this information from two sources, finding a median in between. And we'll sort of watch it propagate through the system as I shift the stimulus. And you can, on B1, that's what you can add movement now, slow movement, so people can follow. And remember, you're getting information only from those two sources. Try not to pay attention to everyone else. Shift the stimulus. And so A4, also remember that you're getting information from above you, from the sounds, interpreting that, also from A4s, these higher regions. That's going to add a little more change in the system. Maybe B1 start to shift a little faster, slightly faster movement. Okay, so I'm just now seeing that finger web kind of propagate down to A1. It's made its way all the way to shift. So it's a little tougher for the participants, but for the viewers, we can sort of follow it as it's. And A4 or B1 if you want to add another hand. I think everybody has the feel for it. And let's stop there. So I would love to hear just quickly before we go on to the next one that's a little more complicated, how that felt, or if there are any questions, or you could, like it was making sense or feeling sense.
I have no idea what happened. I just tried to focus on replicating, and I was trying to integrate your sound input, but I was hoping for a little more to become a little more extreme.
It does later, yeah. I wanted to keep once you start adding chaos to this or larger prediction error or more chaos to the system, it starts breaking down, and sort of that's kind of what we're moving towards. One issue though is I'm having trouble with my I would love my you're not hearing my computer sounds apparently.
I'm hearing a sine wave.
Yeah, I'm playing that from my phone. It would be a little easier if I could share my computer audio. So if anybody has a, which today is acting a little strange. I can't hear you, Karina, by the way.
That's all right. Wait. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, but I think you just figured it out, no? You shared your you can share your audio. Yes.
Yeah, let's try this. Okay. There we go. Can everybody hear that? Much better. There, and you can hear that high sound. Can somebody give me a signal when it's too high, when it's just really annoying? Okay, got it. I know the levels now. Perfect. Now let's go to the next section. So,
Brody, just one question to be sure. I get the information from you and from A1, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah, so, you know, the metaphor for that is you're getting information, again, stimulus from the outside world, from the sensory motor system that's propagating up the hierarchical levels to the more abstract regions of the brain, the representational parts. And, you know, that sort of gets processed, and this is all happening simultaneously, of course. And then the brain makes a model of the world. I should mention also, maybe we can speak about this a little later, but these are very mechanical models for brain functioning, and hopefully we can talk about alternatives to those models. But you know, this is one hyper mechanical model. But so the brain makes a model of the world or a prediction, and then it filters down. And then that generates an action that's either updating the model of the world or taking some kind of physical action. So we're going to go to a more complicated stimulus. And we'll do this for a few minutes just to sort of nail down our understanding of the system. And then we'll start to introduce prediction error. And here's stimulus 1. And you can start B1. And A4, you can also start from the top down with the sound. And yeah, B1, we can add movement. We're using both hands. Great. And if there are any viewers watching, it's best to have your screen into 2 columns. Just a reminder, have your screen, all the thumbnails in 2 columns, with A1, B1 at the bottom, A4, B4 at the top. And so everyone on the B side, if you could start to focus on my voice a little bit. Keep going, but focus on my voice. As I raise, I'll be raising the sound to a higher level or a higher pitch. This will mean that you'll start to give more weight to the prediction error. What that means is instead of a 50-50 medium between the person next to you and the person underneath of you, the node underneath of you and the node next to you, you'll pay more attention, you'll give more weight to the information you're receiving below you. For you, B4, that means B3. That means that's what you're paying more attention to, B3. B3, you're paying more attention to B2 than A3. B2, so B1, does that make sense? You're paying more attention to the stimulus than you are to A1. And that's, as I raise the sound higher and higher, you start to pay more attention to, again, to what's underneath of you and not across from you. And this is the same for A4. You'll start to, as I raise the sound, you'll pay more attention to the sound than B4. We'll start slowly. As the sound is higher, you can also intensify movement. The sound is lower, we'll move back to a 50-50 split, a median between your two inputs. Okay. We should probably stop there. We're already about 15 minutes into Hito's time. Are you okay? It's okay.
Totally okay.
Yeah. And so I'd love a chance just for a very brief debrief before we move on to the discussion with Hito. If there aren't, is there any immediate responses that come to mind? Yeah.
Would it be possible to play back the recording just for a little bit, because I only focused on the inputs I was supposed to watch, so I have no idea of the choreography that was created.
We edit the video later, and then that will be online, and so you'll be able to watch the choreography. But I won't be able to play back the recording for you right now. Yeah. So what we see is this kind of clear, again, propagation of this particular movement through the system. And then we see it kind of break down and then come back together. But of course, the individual nodes can't see that because it's so hard to focus on just those two inputs simultaneously. Yeah, but I'll send you, and I send that video to all the participants before it goes out to the world anyway. So you have a chance to review it. And of course, if anybody has a problem with any of the footage whatsoever, then I don't show it. I blur your face or remove you altogether.
But just one question, did the system move as you predicted?
Well, it's always hard to predict because each group is different. But it does, the reliable thing that does happen is once we didn't get into it in the detailed way that I'm able to in the past, where it's just a small group and no viewers, but and especially in a live situation, it's much easier to manage. But the reliable part is you can see when we start to raise the prediction error gain, meaning the individuals on the right, the neurons on the B side, start to give more weight to the error and react more intensely. There is confusion that you can see in the system. And that does relate in some ways, for me, although it's a very loose model, in the way that, prediction error, they said that prediction error is this kind of evolutionary tool that we have to, manage the world when these models start to go wrong. And in some ways, I can see that relationship when in your movement. Yeah, when they become more erratic and one individual is trying to keeps trying to update their movement model, but it's but it's changing too radically on the other side, and there starts to be a mismatch. Yeah. So, but so in that way, I guess it is. Yeah, I've reliably seen that in all of the sessions. E4. Yeah.
I thought it was really quite astonishing that, if you're looking at two different inputs, how difficult it actually is to make something in between, because a lot of your, I guess, structure is already performing itself in front of you, and not to be carried away by the other's movements in a kind of carbon copy. I thought that was really interesting.
Maybe I'll do a brief runda with whoever is here. If you had a response in, let's say, 2 sentences or 3 sentences, A1, what would that be? And you don't have to speak, of course, if you don't want.
Yeah, actually, I find it the most difficult, unable to actually generate everything, anything, it was all about this kind of mediation and duplication, and yeah, and the inability to create my own movements was very limiting.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the generation sort of happens. It doesn't happen at the individual level. It happens. It happens in all the movements that are happening simultaneously and how they shift around the grid. So in that sense, it's almost meant to do that in a way, and you'll sort of see that more clearly when you see the video later. Yeah. But as an individual, you really are limited in terms of like.
Yeah, I would say that the greatest difficulty in that sense was not to try and actually fuck with the system and add my own things just to see what happens then.
Yeah, I mean, the input is really only, again, it's only coming from outside of the world, and then the model that's being created from up above. Yeah. B2, if you had 2 or 3 sentences, 2 or 3, or B1, if you had a 2 or 3 sentence response, quickly, what might that be? I was just doing a little runda to see just around, just to reconnect with everybody before we move on really quickly. If you just had a 2 or 3 sentence response.
I recognize that I was focusing a bit more on your stimulation than on A1. To me, it's like much more intense, and I was actually then trying to reproduce the objects that you were sending, like that you were showing, and then afterwards it was very my movement was actually very rigid, like I didn't move too much because I was focusing on actually just forms that you were sending, and then looking on A1, it got more organic. My movement got more organic. So the combination of just a form, like the stimulus you were giving, and then the movement from A1 made it more organic. But your stimulus was, for me, much more intense or stronger.
Or more salient. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. B2, did you have, you don't have to respond, of course, but just a few sentences if you have.
I found that I had a certain bias towards the movements of A2, and that was revealed when the intensity of the sound turned out to work, and I was more focusing on B1 as it was the task. But then in reflecting this, I felt that I was anyways more focusing on B1 because we shared the same number.
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. Yeah, keep that in mind. Interested why that is. A2, would you have a few sentences?
I have had some problems because I haven't had my mirror option on. So it was not like in the mirror, it was like different. Yeah. So it was.
I saw that, yeah.
But I love the concentrated form of like being only with like these 2 people, and I felt there's more communication I actually have had with like B2. It felt a little bit like my brother or like my partner in a team, which I have a relationship with and interact. But I felt like A3 is like more a dominant form, and then it's kind of like channeling through me to B2, which I then also was like dominating more, which I felt. So, and one time I kind of like felt that like there was like more things coming from A3, like from top, which then also appeared on like B2 side without them actually focusing on me. And then I felt there was like a correlation between like B1 and A4 or something. So yeah, that was a little bit like my perception.
Thanks. And Orion, B3. I mean, I know you work extensively with algorithmic choreographies and lately even much more complex neural networking models. I'd love to hear, maybe if you want to speak about that a little bit later in the discussion. I'd love to hear your experience.
Sure. I think it's a really interesting schematic, like this kind of this kind of bidirectional loop, which allows us all to have kind of two inputs that we're mating together, or kind of finding a middle ground between. It's really nice that we just concentrate on these 2 points, and then it creates a kind of distribution of the information through all of us. It's a really neat model. I thought it was really, nice. I was sort of trying to switch, my attention was switching a little bit, because I was trying to sort of see what was happening overall, and then also focus on my 2 tasks. And I didn't really understand I didn't yet understand how this right-hand column is dealing with the prediction error. Like I didn't get that in my understanding, as how one part is dealing with a prediction error and another part's, I don't know, dealing with a prediction. But hopefully that will clarify for me later on. But as a kind of collective intelligence task, I thought it was doing something really interesting.
Yeah, and on that, yeah, I'll just keep moving forward. Yeah, thanks. A3.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to mention that for me, the most dominant element that made me move my hands was the chance of how my eyes were getting tired from the one signal or the other. For example, the visuals behind B3 and the visuals behind A4 sometimes made my eyes not see very well. So it was at some point more dominant the B3, and at some point the A4, and it was quite it was very playful the way my eyes was looking at the one point or the other. So I thought I was moving very mechanically, because I wasn't moved by both movements at the same time, but I was trying to see at once this and then the other. So it was it was like I tried to do it slow motion to combine both signals.
And did that help when you slow down and were more conscious about each signal, or did it help if you sort of stayed quick and just let it flow?
I think it helped. Doing it slow motion when I got very, very distracted, and just try to visually copy both images I was seeing, and then try to add on movement, because otherwise I was getting a little bit distracted.
Thanks. B4? Or
And
Penny?
I think I agree a lot with what everybody else is saying, but what I also really strongly noticed was like my intense urge to gamify and disrupt the experience, which I didn't do, but there was like this overwhelming like giggle inside me to want to do that.
Yeah, to hack it. Yeah. It's I mean, to a certain extent, if we were maybe more in the prediction error phase, that added chaos will sort of start to actually, it's kind of designed for that in a way, at least in the later phase, you know. The issue here in this environment is like it's you wouldn't be able to see so easily how your hack or your intervention moves through the system, but in a live environment, it's yeah, you can kind of out of the corner of your eye, you can see, you know, you can sort of see how it's shifting up and down the line because we sit in lines across from each other. Yeah. So Hito, I know you spoke a bit before. If you have anything else to say, of course, I would love to.
No, I mean, I had a lot of fun. I thought it was amazing. I was the opposite of Penny. I really was a conformist. My only desire was to see more or less the whole thing, so that I would have known, you know, how the signals look when they propagate and so on. So that was my only regret, but I guess we can see it at a later point. But I assume that a set of quite simple rules, I mean, try to find a compromise between two signals, must have created what I think is a very interesting propagation of signals through a system. No, that's what I think happened.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I guess the first time that I saw it all happen simultaneously, to respond to what you're saying, the first time I saw it all happen simultaneously, from an objective point of view, when I wasn't participating, I was surprised. Yeah, how interesting the movement was, and watching it flow through, and even the alterations or the hacks, Penny, like I said before, they get the other kind of nodes in the system start to adjust for it. It adjusts for like wild diversions, you know, and eventually it kind of reaches a homeostasis again somehow. Like, and that's interesting to watch as well. I do agree in this case, I don't think I was able to explain the prediction error and the prediction weight part, Orion. And I think that's something I'm still trying to finagle. I mean, I might even need a third column, and that column on the C, you know, C1, C2, C3, that third column is the prediction weight, you know, or prediction gain. It's like a gain on an amplifier, you know, it's either at 1 or it's at 10. And there could be an extra person who's just taking the signal, deciding how high the prediction error is and turning it up. So that's one thought. We might need 3 columns, but so I want to thank everybody. It was amazing to watch from my side, and hand it over because we're so far into your time, Hito. I apologize.
So fine.
I
Not a problem.
Hand it over to Karina and you. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brody. It really was fascinating.
So, yeah, let me just briefly respond, because I would like to contextualize it in a larger context, in terms of also the initial presentation by your neuroscientist colleague. And the thing that really struck me most, even when you first sent me this diagram, was that it seems to model a system dealing potentially also with conspiracy theory or social delusion. That's, of course, the thing that struck me most. Of course, there's also a purely or a formal angle to it, which you contextualize beautifully with the Trisha Brown performance. But moving away from the formal angle, this social angle seems extremely pertinent to me, because if I understood correctly, and maybe we can briefly switch back into, you know, how the prediction error moves up and down the neurons. If I understand correctly, the prediction error has, under certain circumstances, a tendency to sort of grow on its own or to encapsulate into a form of feedback bubble. So basically, it's something that's being trained through the system, if I understand correctly. So we could also compare it to the propagation of news in filter bubbles and other, you know, contagion events, maybe let's call it like that. So my question is really, and this is why I think that this approach is super fascinating, is it possible to basically reverse engineer it? Meaning to basically deprogram prediction error through this kind of game, or let's call it a training. Could we think of not only deprogramming social delusion or conspiracy theory? I'm not talking about psychosis now. That's, I feel, too dangerous for me. I'm just talking about it in social terms. Or could one, for example, untrain social bias, which I think probably also propagates through the same process? Could it be reverse engineered, you know, by basically untraining some reflexes? For example, you know, in the initial presentation, there was this Pavlovian reflex creation of the allergy and the hamburger. Would it be possible to untrain social bias using this, or more or less the same kind of input stimulus, you know, to basically reverse engineer that system? And even to make it more general, this is what I've been thinking a lot about, you know, in relation to the idea of LARPing as a whole, that of course it is a training, can be a training to basically create a muscle memory for social reflexes. Could one, in this case, use a LARP basically to train or to deprogram people from, you know, their prediction errors, which have basically grown because no one, or society didn't stop their propagation, but in fact encouraged that propagation.
Should I respond?
Yeah, sure. Or maybe everyone, you know.
Yeah, please. I mean, I have a few quick responses. Several. Such a great statement. Such a great question. I guess the first thing you mentioned, I don't know if Phil is still here. He could speak better to this than I, but I mean, you're spot on from my understanding of how these aberrant prediction errors, when they're repeated on a regular basis, they do, for an individual suffering from involuntary hallucination or delusion, they tend to get embedded, right? They get like they get embedded in a person's memory. They begin to get more extreme. And then they're harder in a way. I'm probably not using the right terminology here, but I think you get the general sense. Then they're harder to extract, right? Or they're harder to manage. But that's a process that happens over time. So can that happen at a social level with social delusion? I mean, I think I'm not sure. I mean, I think researchers are working on that now, and what would that look like? Specifically in terms of conspiracy theory, that was definitely one of the reasons I was attracted to this idea, and spoke with Asborn Dierendal, who's at Trondheim University in the Philosophy and Religious Studies department. And he's really the person, he's been writing about conspiracy theory for, for decades. He, interestingly enough, has created a small set of, I don't think deprogramming games is the right word, but they do have a small card game that they would, that they try out as experiments with students to gamify a conversation about conspiracy theory and social delusion formation, to inoculate the students against that potential. And that's Asbjorn Dierendal, and I'm sorry, I forget the name of the game, but he was an influence for this. And I guess in a sense, a work of mine, a past work from like 2009, 2010, level 5, where we went through these 2-day live role-playing games based on large group awareness programs from the 70s. I did definitely see those events as an inoculation tool. So you're moving through this situation where you're role-playing somebody who's trying to have this transcendent experience in this large group and this transformation in this large group awareness seminar. And so, but you're simultaneously have this critical distance to experientially observe what those techniques that those seminars felt like. And in a way, one of the hopes is that's an inoculation against some of the kind of depoliticized, individualistic uses of radical therapy in the 70s and the 80s by large group awareness programs. And those ideas are sort of ubiquitous throughout the culture, but such as magical voluntarism, which is, I create the world as I visualize it, this sort of thing. It's so common we don't notice it anymore, but once they've sort of experientially moved through it, you start to notice those ideas and how they're embedded in our daily lives everywhere after you've played through it for a few days. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Philip, are you still there actually? Just so.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, Phil, hey. I didn't know you were here.
No, I've been here the whole time. I just turned off my camera. I watched the performance too. It's fabulous. And I think that Hito's question is spectacular too. It made me think of two things. One is a clinical phenomenological occurrence, which is called folie à deux, which you may have heard of. This is where somebody who is psychotic and ill is living in close quarters, often isolated from the rest of the world, but with one family member or 2 or 3 family members, and they catch the delusion. And the best example is usually delusions of parasitosis, right? Somebody starts to feel as though they have insects on or under their skin, and their close family members believe that they too are infected. And one can sort of go increasingly more conceptual from there, that we do catch beliefs from one another. And the solution to that particular problem is to separate. And when you take the person who has caught the psychotic delusion from their family member, they resolve very quickly without a need for treatment, whereas the person who is the sort of initiator still needs meds and psychotherapy to sort of deal with those challenges. And then the other thing, which is much more kind of contemporary and relevant to the situation in which we find ourselves now, my colleague at Yale, Nicholas Christakis, who you may have come across for various different reasons, he was appointed at Yale to head our group of network scientists. And he was working initially at Harvard and recruited an entire Harvard class and interviewed them and tracked them through getting their flu vaccine and watched how vaccination behaviors were sort of catching between groups of friends, and particularly if people talked about their vaccine and showed pictures of themselves on social media having gotten the vaccine. And that was an extremely effective way of combating the contagion with a sort of belief or action contagion.
Counter contagion.
Right, right. And so, you know, figuring out who in one's network is able to exert that type of influence or not might be a really effective and interesting way of tweaking, you know, how we make people, render them more or less susceptible to influences. And one could see how that could be used for good and also for ill. You know, these are extremely powerful connections. When I express my reservation about social beliefs, it's really a very specific reservation about how they're handled in the brain rather than them having any impact at all, because I know that they're extremely powerful. We don't yet know how to sort of wield that power effectively, but I think there's gold in those hills for sure in terms of behavior change, which I think is a good thing, especially now.
I'm sure there are other questions also. I mean,
yeah. So definitely to everyone, please be invited to put your questions in the chat, or even also just to raise your hand. I was just still very curious about, well, I was even then now thinking whether LARP in a way is also a model, because certainly it is a simulation of sorts, or in some cases it is. But that actually brought me to the questions about the models that you showed us and how models seem to generally carry ideology. And also Brody had mentioned that this was a mechanical model, and that, yeah, there was also alternatives. And I was, yeah, a bit curious if you wanted to say more about that, and also maybe this is in some way also a bit a segue to yeah, basically to the idea of artificial neural networks and how these models are influencing each other, or in which way. I mean, yeah, and in that sense, how they are, of course, bound by the metaphoric weight that we also see having great influences on us, on people. This is a long question, sorry.
Well, yeah, well, in that core part, Phil, do you want to respond to that? Because I've asked you, and I'm always curious what you think about those alternative to these highly mechanistic models. I mean, I'm seeing kind of combinations of lots of different, like more phenomenal work, you know, and the mechanical models sort of just jam together like a nil stuff work with body, you know, somatic delusions, and you know, combining these phenomenological models with these mechanistic models. So, yeah, I'd love to hear your take on.
You know, this approach is very much a kind of bridging or implementational idea, right? That you want to link the computational goals of a system to how those computations are realized. And in doing so, you want to make some new predictions about phenomenology or behavior or something else. I think one of the things that we're deeply committed to in this line of work is sort of blurring the distinction between perception and belief. And there are some people for whom that's anathema. And that's understandable, right? That there are things that feel much more beliefy, and there are things that feel much more perceptual. For example, you know, I've seen that rotating hollow mask many times, and I know how it works, but I can't unsee it. I can't choose to not see the switch. The same with various other perceptual illusions. And that leads some psychologists to think that there is a very rigid distinction between thinking and perceiving, and that the flow of information, indeed, from perception to belief is unidirectional. I think there's a good case to be made for things working that way a lot of the time. But as we've started to sort of explore this space a little bit, there are various countercultural groups, subcultures. I'm thinking of tulpomancy. I don't know if you've heard of that. It seems like a sort of an extreme version of LARPing for one, where you basically imagine in your head through sort of practices and breathing techniques and imaginative approaches that you create an avatar of a friend for yourself. And often these people who engage in this, it began and became popular amongst Tibetan Buddhists in the mountains. They would create these companions in their minds. And it's become recently much more popular among young men who play a lot of video games and are very fond of many of the characters in the video games that they play with. And so you can find people describing how they do this, their relationships with these avatars, and to the extent that they are actually perceiving these characters, then that would be an example of your beliefs and your imaginative practices changing what you believe. And so the information can flow in the opposite direction. And so you sort of have varying kind of degrees of separation between perception and belief. And one should then sort of, if we're being good scientists, decide, which is the best model that accounts for the data. Given that there are people who believe that they can do this, including our psychics too, right? They have this willful control over what they experience. Again, this would be another example of belief impacting or penetrating perception. So yeah, that would be the sort of the main contender, would be our model where there's a sort of two-way interaction between perception and belief, much as we saw things going up and down through the hierarchy, versus a model where they're much more separate and they live in a sort of separate apps or modules where the information only flows in one direction. How that works in neural network models, the distinction would be between feedback and feed-forward networks, and that things like deep learning often don't have these top-down priors embedded in them. I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't, but they're usually sort of all feed forward rather than feedback. The only difference being that the training data can give you kind of empirical priors, right? So when you do deep dreaming and you clamp the layers and you read out from them what they appear to be responding to, they'll often insert things into the image that they've been trained on. So when you look at those deep dream incepted images, they often have dogs and goldfish and pagodas, because that was the data set that the network was trained upon. There's no reason not to sort of more formally embed those priors with things like deep Boltzmann machines that sort of embed and sort of embody many of the processes that come up in the types of accounts that we've talked about today. But in terms of the sort of more, I guess, industrial applications, people haven't sort of seen the use or the necessity for those sorts of connections yet for the types of tasks that are being solved. But I could imagine that they would be useful in the future, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Hito, kind of bridging the gap between those two. I don't have direct working knowledge of working with artificial neural networks, but what I understand from maybe some of the neuroscientists who are, and especially like Anil Seth, who has talked about beast machines and a kind of machine phenomenology that we can't anthropomorphize, but it's like something, it's not like us, but it's like something, he says, and especially when it's doing something akin to hallucinating or making these errors. Are you experiencing that as you're working with the material?
No. So I think any engineer also on their side would emphasize from the get-go that artificial neural network is not the brain and only mimics some of the most basic assumed functions of a brain. So this is their starting point. But maybe to make it more tangible and concrete, I mean, I've only worked with very simple application, let's say next video frame prediction or something like that. And really in those models, the output is determined on the training data to a very, very large degree. So basically, it can only predict what it knows already. And these processes of, let's say, interpretation or maybe feedback increasing itself, this is something I haven't really seen, at least in the visual neural network models at all. I've seen interesting things in the text generation recently, but honestly, I cannot really tell you how these work. I'm not really sure the people who programmed these things even completely know themselves. But at least in terms of having unexpected outcomes, that would be closer, I think. Yeah, as an exercise, I mean, we're not going to go through this, but I asked GPT-3 to predict a LARP. It wrote 30 characters, which are hilarious and so on. It even wrote, you know, the small reviews in the press of that LARP for me. So in terms of prediction, it was at least plausible. Let's put it like that. In visual, I haven't seen it. It's very close to what it's been fed on. And this, of course, has many implications for temporality, because what these networks do, and maybe this is something that we could ask also in the context of the model you've applied, is that they basically prolong the training data into the future. So they act on what they know and just mirror this into the future, which means that it's not really a prediction because it doesn't account for novelty. New things cannot really happen in those models. And this is really what I find fascinating in the model you've described, because actually prediction is successful, it seems to me, please correct me if I'm wrong, if the number of options are restricted. Because psychosis seems to arise at the moment where basically everything is possible. And people are like, oh, whatever, I don't care, that's fine, you know. So they do not show any surprise, even if they get faced with something which ought to surprise them. So I think that in this model, prediction rather operates like a, let's say, orientation tool to sort of function within a reality, however you want to define it. And once everything's possible, this reality breaks down and people go into psychosis, it seems. So that's different from, let's say, my very simple visual neural networks who only predict what they know already. This is more about, you know, restricting possibilities, maybe also finding consensus over reality. That's probably the prior step. There already needs to be a consensus about that reality. And once this is broken, once reality sort of shatters or its interpretation, then prediction error starts to multiply and to propagate.
That feels really accurate to me, or to my limited understanding. Phil, does that feel
I think that's a great way of thinking about it. I think we need to sort of think about the formation process or the delusional mood, as German psychopathologists would call it, that, the world seems sort of sinister and pregnant with new meaning that needs to be figured out. And then once you have the delusion, it becomes a sort of tool that can explain all subsequent aberrant experiences that you have. It becomes a sort of catch-all, which, exactly as you described. I think it works really nicely. And that would, of course, come out of a scheme like ours, wherein you're very, very uncertain initially. And so you weight your prediction errors very highly and you engage in lots of learning. But then once you've come to this conclusion, you tune that precision weighting down drastically and don't really allow the subsequent prediction errors to change your beliefs. So you're just sort of ready. It's anything goes.
Yeah, do we still have a moment for a question from the audience, everyone?
Sure.
A2, do you want to speak?
Yeah, my question would be, or go to Hito, Philip, and Karina, to you too, because it's kind of like on the edge of like LARPing. Also the question of like if there's already experience in like clinical studies, and also the question back to like to the question how to reverse engineering the system. My question would be like, what kind of like system are we actually talking about? And I think like for me it's very important to like bring in like the dimension of like generations, as I'm some sort of like TikTok addict. I kind of like see that Gen Z is kind of like never maybe like felt so alone, because it's kind of like of course I'm like generalizing here, but it's kind of like living in some sort of like reality which is like also like not shareable, for instance like with parents or whatever. And then I kind of like think, especially the way how you approach TikTok as a medium, isn't it already some sort of like LARPing actually on like how you can like also like role play, but also like see how other kids or like people actually kind of like also like perform in this kind of like way, and then learn from that and like try different kind of like sorts. Of course you always try to be like authentic, but there are like so many sorts of like possible ways on like how you can interact in like TikTok. So I think this is like very interesting. And then I kind of like felt, are we actually talking about like more millennials here on like LARPing, like doing it as like a praxis really, because it's not a way like how we actually grew up or like how we interact with like social media, or it's something which is like more new to us and we have to like learn it. And then again, also like the question of like, what kind of like system do we have to like reverse or engineer, or what kind of like reality? Don't we have like a huge multiplicity, especially right now? And then I think my question would be like, yeah, what are we exactly talking about here? Or like, yeah. Thank you.
I mean, I can respond to the last part, if that's okay. Yeah, and I
yes.
believe the other parts. So I was talking about, especially in the terms of the model we played, of how I was immediately applying it to the question how social bias propagates and multiplies and reinforces itself. This is what I mean with system. For me, it was a process in which systemic bias, like do you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Like, for example, let's say racism or something like that is increased within this process. So, or conspiracy theory or whatever. So this is what I mean. Can one basically reverse engineer this type of formation and thus more or less reduce it instead of increasing it? This was what I meant by the system, because most obviously there is a lot of structural bias in all different parts of the world, but especially technology and probably also science, but also social media. So I was wondering if my assumption is correct, and this has to do with prediction error, if this mechanism could be used to transform that. That's what I meant. But I think, I mean, just to add on to it, we could probably also apply this question to TikTok as a system, right? Because it is a system. It is a system of propagation. It is a system where, as you say, people learn from one another. They also imitate one another or respond to another. So there is a system of communication and conversation. The thing that I would add to that is that it would be important to figure out how this conversation is structured, or what exactly is structuring it, and how for example, the rules of infection or propagation or spread are really modeled within that system.
I would go even further and think about how these systems were designed and what the end is. When I look at something like Twitter and TikTok, I feel as though they were created with these rules of reinforcement learning and prediction error reduction in mind. You know, I've started getting alerts from Twitter that I might have an alert to check on or not. And of course, that's extremely motivating and engaging, for me at least. Maybe that says more about me than perhaps I'd feel comfortable revealing. But I think, you know, you can think about modeling outrage and sort of responses and pylons that you observe in response to people's mistakes that they've made on Twitter through these sorts of reinforcement and internally reinforcing mechanisms that it feels good when someone agrees with you and it feels bad when they disagree with you. And people will create situations in order to feel better in that way. I don't know so much about TikTok, but it feels as though it has the same kind of memification mechanisms that some of the Chan boards had, right? That people are trying to find stimuli, visual stimuli, usually videos that are the most popular. And, you know, for whatever reason, particular videos make it to the top and become the most popular. I know on the Chan boards, they were supposed to be the most offensive. That was how that whole thing started. But I think TikTok works in the same sort of way. So it's like a consensus decision, honing in on something that's incredibly salient for reasons that are often not necessarily verbally reportable, but they tend to work, which I find fascinating. And I think there's a lot of information that we could glean from there, including this sort of reverse engineering approach.
Yeah, and another thing I would maybe latch on to from your comment or question is this idea you mentioned as multiplicity, where I was wondering if this is maybe a sensation that comes up even more so when you have social interactions predominantly in the virtual realm. And I was, yeah, also now curious in terms of subjectivity, the notion of subjectivity as a construct. This is something that Brody, you have been also busy with or interested in, and how that also is related or can be maybe experienced through LARPing. And maybe you can speak to that a little bit in relation also to the sensation of multiplicity, I guess.
I can. It's it's such a massive subject. You know, it's a huge stake. It's hard to subjectivity, our understanding of self, and you know, I'm almost scared to respond because it's, you know, it's, of course, my limited understanding originally when I was getting into LARP, and came from more from social science. So Irving Goffman and, you know, everyday presentation of the self, and sort of sociologists in the 40s and 50s who were already understood that we were a constellation of roles that we played throughout our daily life to different sets of people, you know, or in different social environments. And then I guess what I'm seeing now with Phil, especially has mentioned this with some of the social turn, is some experimentation that's trying to prove that to some degree. That I mean, as Dimitri Bolis says, you know, the self. He's a young researcher in Berlin. You know, the self unfolds and manifests itself beyond the individual, you know, in social relations, and it's this, and then of course, and Neil Seth would refer back to these different types of self. There's the phenomenal self, you know, the one that the ownership of a body, the somatic self, and then of course this other entity, which is, and of course they're interconnected in a constellation, but you know, what we think of as this continuity of self over time as a person that we have, you know, thoughts and beliefs. And I mean, that's and then my own personal experiences with dissociative, involuntary dissociative phenomenon would speak more to these alterations of presence and kind of phenomenal presence and living with that on a regular basis. But I'm, and of course, you know, anyone who's in a gender transition has some more intense experience on some of those levels than me, and could maybe speak better to that. But all I can say is that I've seen or experienced different manifestations of that in the different LARPs that I've run, more the ones that are longer term, like, you know, up at 4 hours to 2 days, and where there's kind of where it's clear how fluid the self becomes. You know, I can see the physical transformation, especially in the pupils at about 4 hours. Some of the experience, and I can see them start to become someone else in this very strange way. Some of the more experienced LARPers have told me that if they've LARPed long enough, and their short-term memory fills up with character memory, then they start dreaming in character. You know, and then these other situations, especially in level 5, where you have these individuals who are moving through the self-actualization situation and unsure whether they're self-actualizing a character or whether they're self-actualizing themselves. And then conversations with them later about how that's affected their life. And for me, the more I dig into this subject, the more it feels clear that subjectivity is just mashed potatoes. I mean, there's just like, and it's scary, but it's also freeing. I mean, there's really just nothing there. but we do have this ability to construct some meaning, based on all of the social relations we have and the environments around us. So how do we construct some kind of meaning from that? Even though we're just sort of empty. So, but that's my take, just from what I've experienced. I don't know, maybe others have another take, or Phil. Yeah. So, but I should stop there. It's a massive subject.
Yeah, no, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. At the same time, we exposed objectivity to be fraud, so then we're really a bit in trouble.
Yeah, but I can give a shout out to some of the researchers who have helped me understand this, because I'm not doing this on my own. So Sven Hoare Klimpe at NTNU, who's writing some really beautiful work about the history of our understanding of self. What did the word self mean? What word did we use to describe self in the 1600s or the 1700s or the 1800s? How did that develop? When did we even start to have an understanding of like an individual subjective self? So there's so much interesting work out there. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, I mean, sorry, just it's really an afterthought. But of course, prediction error will increase the more unpredictable things get. No, I mean, in that sense, it's very historical, and another consequence of destabilization, maybe.
Yeah, this is a really good comment. Sorry. I was just also thinking how we perceive reality through the predictions that are based on the past, and then the future is expected to be the same as the past, but that assumes a certain stability or stasis to some extent. But then as the more things change, the change is not sort of calculated in as much, and the more violent the changes, maybe the more error there will be. I don't know, or the more.
Yeah, of course, also irrational, I mean, how are you going to predict crypto? You have to be inside the mind of a mad king who rules this thing. It's otherwise, there is no rational other way to predict it. And of course, if you then, how are you, even prediction is equal prediction error, because there is just no more rational criteria or parameters.
Yeah, I think if you look at it, there are lots of historical examples where, when the world becomes extremely uncertain or goes through dramatic shifts, that's when conspiracy theories flourish, right? From the Black Death through the fire of Rome and 9/11 and what has happened to us in the past year. Whenever people are uncertain and the world is unpredictable, we reach to enemyship and nefarious, powerful others to explain what's happened to us rather than simpler explanations.
Can I quickly say something? Yeah, this also reminds me of Elena Esposito. I don't know if you know her. She's, I think, a media philosophy person, and she wrote about the, I think, also a lot of on uncertainty and predictability of the future and future in relation to especially economy and also money, and how money actually works. And at the end, if you have a lot of money, your future is, even though if it's not predictable, it's more safe for you. So you have less risk. So whatever comes, you can pay for it, or you can buy it or whatever. And an interesting thing I also think is what she says when it comes to actually to produce uncertainty in the future from people who actually have the power to react to that uncertainty. So it's kind of actually a good thing for them to like create that uncertainty, because it's kind of like a adverse effect for like other people who would then have like a disadvantage. Yeah, it kind of like reminded me on the conversation.
I mean, those sorts of dynamics are present in predator-prey relationships in nature too, right? If you're a prey animal, the best thing to do is act as unpredictably and irrationally as possible so that you can't be predicted and caught. And so I wonder if that has relevance too.
Has trickled up to the predator's mind. Also works to his advantage, I guess.
Yeah.
There was another question.
Is there?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
I have a kind of question. Oh, maybe not me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
yeah, yeah, you.
I didn't see it.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I'm not sure about what the question is, but it's just, I keep thinking that somehow we, and there was a little bit of this earlier, but somehow we have to kind of speak up for what we're calling prediction error as a positive thing. There's a feeling in the conversation that we're talking about it as a kind of as a negative, and I know that we're living through this time where we're very concerned with conspiracy theories and this kind of a thing, but I feel like this, I don't really have a specific point to make about this, but there's something very positive also about what we're calling prediction error. And we touched on it a little bit when you were talking about the self and, you know, kind of extended notions of self. And I guess even the idea that the self is, in a sense, a kind of prediction error. But also like artistically, you know, like how the future also gets produced through a certain kind of difference with the present, and how there's something really important about, in a sense, getting things wrong or daring to propose something which is not real or preposterous in the chance that can then become a reality, for example. And I wonder, in that case, in that sense of like reverse engineering, how do we make ourselves, in a sense, like more psychotic? How do we make ourselves more prone to error prediction, that we're able to, in a sense, more able to make these prediction errors, more able to be confused, in a sense, about what's real and what isn't. Because there's been a lot of talk about kind of clarifying that, right? Like, and making us less schizophrenic and less psychotic. But I think there's a real need for some kind of psychosis.
Yep, I totally get this point. Yep. But you know, the interesting thing, and the one which I haven't completely understood yet, is that how prediction error relates to, or what kind of consequences it can have. It can have go on, or learn something new, or change the world as an output, right? And it would be interesting for me to know, when does it fork to A, and where does it fork to C, meaning, you know, just changing the circumstances. What is the switch, you know, between the sort of prediction error you are talking about, the one that just simply does not want to conform with the reality as it is?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure what this, it's a little bit too, for me, I don't know, it's a little bit too abstract to kind of identify what the switch is. I can imagine that, I can also imagine there's a situation where both are happening at the same time. You know, so there's a really interesting thing, you know, like I think it was Jung maybe, who talked about, you know, like poets, which was, he could have been talking about any kind of artistic process. And he talked about, there's a certain moment where you're working on an artwork that you feel that the artwork itself has a kind of agency, that you feel, and he described it as had this really nice phrase, the golden parasite, that that this work somehow exists in another realm, and it wants to be born, it wants to come into reality, and so it parasites itself onto you. and uses you as the kind of the vessel, the vehicle through which this thing is going to come into the world, right? And so there's a kind of, and in that moment, there's a feedback loop, right? Like you're listening to this thing that wants to come into the world, but you're also asking yourself questions about it, right? Like you're updating your inner reality as you're updating the reality of this thing that's trying to come into existence. And so I think in that case, they're both kind of updating at the same time, right? They need to, yeah, I don't think there's like it doesn't necessarily have to be either or. I think both can be happening. But that's also a really nice, like it's a really interesting example of a kind of positive psychosis, right? That you imagine that this entity is, is speaking to you, is actually wanting to, is not just a kind of, it's not just a thing of your imagination. But then again, it's also really interesting that the say like a poem or like an artwork or a piece of clay has its own agency, right? Like it does have agency. Like there's certain information that a piece of clay can hold, and there's certain information that it can't hold. There's certain things that it can't do, and there's certain things that it can do, and we would necessarily do under certain circumstances. And so there's something, there's another mind that also comes into existence when we start interacting things and start setting up these feedback relationships between us and, say, a piece of clay or a piece of paper and a pen. And then I wonder how then, if we talk about that as the mind, then how does that shift this conversation about prediction error?
What is the contrary of prediction?
Memory?
Or... No, because I'm just imagining what you're describing is this thing talks to you from the next level of neurons, right? And it sees you as an error. You should conform to it instead of the other way around. So there's an invert temporality.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, Orion. I mean, like going down to, the level of the material and advocating, maybe not like a vitalist sort of, it has vitality and consciousness, but saying there is vital matter, there is it does have some kind of agency, even though there's one that we can't understand, and then how does that emerge into some sort of consciousness? But I wanted to touch on maybe the first, if that's what you're saying. It may not be, but it was great. But I wanted to respond to the first part about the negative view of prediction error, in the sense that comes out of this conversation, maybe, because we're speaking with Phil, and Phil is very tightly in this the world of psychology research. And when you speak about prediction errors and how they manifest themselves in involuntary delusions and hallucinations for people, those people are suffering. And, I've been to the mental health facility where he's working, and, he's working on these experiments, but then, and these models, but then right across the hall, he's going over and he's speaking with individuals with severe mental illness. And, so he's seeing the suffering that this, and so, but I think for us, we have more of it, and maybe that's why Phil and some of the other researchers like to work with artists, is because we have this ability to play with these notions, and I'll definitely say in the work in the LARPs, I mean, that's really what I'm waiting for, are these kind of neurotic moments that scare me in a way, and then I'll zoom into them and I say, well, we need to do more of that. I'm not sure why that, and it's maybe after I work with the group for a fair amount of time and apply you know, there's a certain amount of like performative algorithms. There's always kind of similar types of affect that rise to the surface, some of it more neurotic than others, you know, in a safe way, in an empathetic way, but I'll sort of start to reproduce or lean more towards those performative algorithms that are generating this more the type of experience that you're describing. Of course, we have to think a lot about safety in that case.
But I really thought it was fascinating that Phil defined, or the border between illness and other types of being was distress. I found that really fascinating. It also seemed like a sensible definition to me.
Yeah, well, and especially in relation.
People can have prediction errors and just ignore, override, or integrate. But if you're in distress, then you have a problem.
Yeah. But we could also expand the definition of distress, right? So you could talk about, you know, you could talk, well, I mean, it's not just one's own distress, right? So like you could talk about the distress of an ecosystem, for example, or a forest. So, you know, it's like, I don't know if this is true, but I imagine that, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Like the level, apparently, like the percentage of sociopaths in the population, as opposed to the percentage of sociopaths who end up being like CEOs of large companies, right? So they're able to kind of see the world in a very kind of distorted way, and yet feel no distress about it at all, right? That's one of the great things about being like a sociopath or a psychopath, is you don't feel particularly distressed about it. But if you expand your definition of mind to include the people around you, or include like an ecosystem, then you can say, well, that's in distress, right? So then you can then we could reframe that and say, like, actually that's a kind of like a health issue, or a mental health issue in a kind of notion of mind. But yeah, it's really interesting as a kind of a dividing line. But I think there's also something about, in a way, there's also like a kind of a need for distress, right? Like in certain circumstances. Like if you want people to change, like if you want society to change, which I guess we all in some sense are interested in that, right? Like how do we is it possible for society to steer itself in a better direction, and how might we do that, or how might we contribute to that steering, or how might we understand that steering, right? And so and part of that is distress, right? Like part of that is realizing you have to feel uncomfortable in your current way of life enough to want to change it. Your own kind of inner errors, or your inner the ways to which your actions are culminating in some kind of like future distress, have to be kind of brought into the present, right? Like you have to rehearse your future stress in the present.
Yeah, just a quick response to that, and maybe to speak to what Hito had said about, you know, creating this related statement you said about creating these, you know, inoculation games, or for lack of a better word. I guess one of the ways that I relate to that, and also, you know, delving into the psychopathological and being open to that, and like as a positive force. I guess I come to that in the sense that, like and also related to LARP. The way I see the LARPs in some way are these temporary communal situations, which possibly have co-created situations, which possibly could be this force for change, right? I know they were for me at a personal level, and that's very. But there is a criticism of that in the sense, well, how really political is that? How useful is that? And because, you know, the social or the lifestyle changes, let's say my parents' generation, especially my mother, made in the 60s and in the early 70s, had drastic consequences. And also, and those consequences were permanent. And here we are kind of, can we do a temporary, lifestyle shift and have some sort of socio-political movement, but without the consequences that, let's say, my parents' generation had to navigate. And I mean, in one way to try and understand that, I was looking at radical therapeutic techniques, from the 60s, and then trying to move through them with some kind of critical distance. And to some degree, I'm not sure how well that holds up as a LARP without Hannah Proctor, who is amazing, who writes a lot about the radical socialist therapy history in Russia and in the UK. She's sort of like, well, the context is missing. It's just not the same context. You can replay those. You can play those radical therapeutic group encounters all you want, but you're missing the context. You're missing consequences that they had to navigate. You're missing why they were there in the first place. And so it is kind of just like playing radical.
Like the context matters so much. Where do these things happen? And I was even wondering a bit while he was explaining about the lab situation that is also not. This is not an empty space either, right? It's also a really specific context, and that brings its own implications. And then I was wondering, because one of the big vectors he was mentioning was the sense of violation and control, and this idea of hierarchy and how that related to delusion. Or I was really curious about that, because that gets carried along oftentimes in certain experiments where there's a very specific setup. And for the conspiracy theories that often revolve around the sense of being controlled, being there's someone who's planning all this, and someone is after us and wants to and there's actually the 5G tower in the mask, and things like that. And I think it's a lot about a personal sense of violation in the end.
Is it something to do with, I'm just saying, shooting some ideas into the out there, but is it something to do with the kind of the acknowledgement of the kind of like the super ego? Like, isn't it ourselves acknowledging that there's something bigger than ourselves, that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, and sort of wrestling with that idea?
In terms of like for Asbjorn at NTNU, I mean, that's one of the key elements of conspiracy theory, is exactly what you described, except that force is nefarious. That force is out to get you. That force is controlling you in a way that's blocking your agency. Yeah.
Sometimes people talk about it as the kind of, I've heard people talking about it as the kind of like the inverse of somehow like a religious or spiritual experience, right? So the positive experience is that there's something bigger, and it's kind of you're a part of this thing. It's bigger than yourself, and it's somehow guiding you or able to guide you. And then the negative is that exact thing, but you experience it, as you say, as something nefarious and dark.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the term that Asbjorn's new book actually is about, while I was writing, I guess maybe even the last 10 years, is they're just now, social scientists are just now starting to, him specifically, to use the term conspirituality. So he's in the religious studies department. So they weren't doing this before, where they were sort of looking at conspiracy theory as a new spiritual movement, actually, and studying it like a religion, where they didn't do that before. Before, they just studied it as a kind of social delusion in a way, and they treated it like a delusion. Now it's like sort of, they're treating it like a belief system, and then they have a whole different set of methodologies to deal with delusion than they do a belief system. So conspirituality, I think, is the term that they're using now. And so,
But I
but
think it's a spectrum, no? It's
yeah,
most probably
yeah,
a spectrum. If there's
yeah.
3 people believing in it, it's a conspiracy theory. But if it's 500,000, it starts being a belief system, no? And then again, it outputs back into the world and basically readjusts reality in relation to the new belief system or the new parameters of reality.
I think there's also this axis of or this dimension of kind of like of repulsion and attraction, you know, like of it's a kind of fundamental human thing that you either move towards something or you move away from it. So, you know, if you're attracted, you move towards, and if you're repulsed, you move away. It's similar to fight and flight also. So that's, I don't know, it reminds me of that too, that there's this feeling of something that's bigger than you, but in this case you're repulsed by it. You want to evade it, you want to move away from it.
Yeah. Yeah, what me in these moments always really puzzles me is, or what I'm wondering is, if this sort of almost postmodern project, let's say, of derealization and like shattering objective truths and understanding that it's a matter of language, or if this is, yeah, what do we do with that in this area of so-called post-truth, so to say? Like, how do we position ourselves? Because I don't know, maybe I'm oversimplifying it also, but it feels like a bit pulling in different directions.
Yep.
Well, this is sort of what it looks like.
Yeah.
It pulls into many different directions.
Yeah,
No, I mean,
you talk to people and dialogue.
no, but I think really key is the moment when everything becomes possible, right? Which seems to happen in this moment called prediction era now. Everything is possible in the negative sense, in the potentially also utopian sense. But it's also an extremely frightening moment, because everything bad is also possible at the same time. So conspiracy theory is, among other things, also an attempt to regain control over a situation, you know, establishing causalities which may not be factual, but at least give a sense of coherence to this complete mess around you, which is also threatening. Plus, also it seems to have this conspiritual, you know, moment where you find other peoples and community, which is also something that provides some sense of protection, I guess, in this situation. So yes, it can pull into all different directions. Everything means possible. Is possible also means that gravity does not exist, or that it is the hand of God, you know.
Yeah.
That I loved that example. That was so beautiful. That pushes down. That's also, you know, that's included in everything's possible.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, does it make sense for humanity to ignore some sets of facts? You know, probably not. But of course, you know, into the whole corpus of facts also for a lot of things which are accepted as facts, but which are also ideologies. Let's face it. So it's complicated.
It is, yes. Yeah, well, I do think this was helpful.
Yeah, it was certainly useful for me. So thank you.
No, thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so
Super
much.
productive and a pleasure also.
I think so. It was great to meet you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hito, great to see you, Karina.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you to all the viewers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Orion.
Thanks a lot.
Brody,
Bye-bye.
nice to come across you.
Yeah, we'll speak again, hopefully soon. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye, A3.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.